Hi, everyone. I'm very, very excited to welcome to Google Michael Kupperman, who's going to be talking about his new book, All the Answers, and about his family's history with quiz kids and the early days of celebrity culture. Mr. Kupperman is an Eisner-winning cartoonist, author. He's done video stuff. I've been a big fan of his for many years, but I think there's no better place to start with his work than his new book, All the Answers. Mr. Kupperman?
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you. Hello. Okay, are we live? Hi, okay, great. Hello, I'm very excited to be here. My family uses Google all the time, and my son is obsessed with it. In particular, Google Street View. He's always telling me he's just seen the Google Street View car, and sometimes he turns out to be right. Google is also part of the story I'm about to tell you, the story of how I created my book, All the Answers, which came out in May of this year. On the cover, it's called a graphic memoir, but I sometimes think a better description might be graphic auto-noir. In some ways, it's a detective story, one in which an individual, me, investigates the past of a member of his family, but in doing so discovers the hidden limitations that have dominated his life. My name is Michael Kupperman. For most of my career, I've been a humorous underground comic artist and illustrator. You might have seen my work in or on The New Yorker, Fortune, The New York Times, Adult Swim, Vice, Saturday Night Live, Heavy Metal, Playboy, and many other places. Until recently, all my sequential work has been humorous until this book. In 2010, my father, Joel Kupperman, retired from the University of Connecticut, where he had taught for 50 years. He seemed more relaxed than he had ever been. Things that used to bother him didn't trouble him at all, or so it seemed. And when I asked if he could talk to me about his childhood, he said he wouldn't mind. This was huge. His formative years had been a forbidden subject in my family for my entire life. All the way through my childhood, any mention of them would visibly upset him. I was astonished that I might have a chance to finally hear something from him about his life when he'd been a quiz kid. Quiz Kids was a show that was on national radio and then on national TV. On it, 5 children would compete to answer questions sent in by listeners. My father had first appeared on it when he was 5 years old and had stayed on it until he was 16. I'm going to play you 2 quick excerpts of the radio version. I've edited these way down, but even so, you'll be able to tell that entertainment back then moved at a different, more leisurely pace. This is how the show opened.
The Quiz Kids, presented by the makers of Alka-Seltzer and One-A-Day brand vitamins.
If a brick weighs 1 pound plus 1/2 brick, how much does the brick weigh?
That's the first question for the Quiz Kids tonight. I wonder if you folks at home can work it out before the children get their hands up. Well, you better work fast because here they are, the Quiz Kids.
That's enough. And this is my father answering a question. He's 6 3/4 years old here, and the celebrity judge is Jack Benny.
Well, 5 1/2 times 2 equals 11 times 3 and the sound equals 34 and 4/7.
34 and 4/7 is right. Good for you. Oh, that's
Funny,
marvelous.
Joe. I had 33 1/2. I was just a little bit off there. I'm sorry.
Well, I think
I must have figured that wrong.
You left.
33.
Well, Joel, after the broadcast, will you get together with the judge and explain it
Well,
to
you
us?
have to multiply by 2 and then
I did it! I multiplied. What? No, wait, here. Wait a minute. Joel.
you multiply by 2 and then you multiply that by 3 and a 7.
I know. I did it twice. I multiplied it twice.
My father had a reported IQ of 219 and could do sophisticated math tricks in his head. The press promoted him as a genius equal to Einstein and Socrates. During most of World War II, he was a household name and universally beloved. Everybody wanted to meet him. Everybody wanted to hear the cute and wise things that came out of his lisping mouth. He was huge. He played himself in a movie, 1944's Chip Off the Old Block, starring Donald O'Connor.
Hey, Sonny, who are you?
I'm Joel Kupperman.
Well, aren't you kind of small to be wandering? Joel Kupperman, the quiz kid?
Sure.
Say, you're the problem child. No problem is too tough for you.
Yeah, but can you keep a secret?
Sure.
They're not so tough.
Well, says you. I'd hate to meet one in a dark classroom.
The star quiz kids toured America every month, making appearances and selling war bonds. This is my father's schedule. They put on shows where they'd compete with senators, ball players, movie stars, professors, scientists. They toured military and naval institutions, visited hospitals, posed for pictures, and sat on strangers' laps a lot. By the end of the war, they had raised more than $120 million for the war effort. I had not understood how famous he really was. I had known, we all knew, that he had been on radio and then TV for years and that it hadn't been fun for him. I'd heard his name mentioned on Rocky and Bullwinkle. I'd seen him mocked on radio days. I'd been told he'd been an inspiration for Salinger. But all these are just details. I'd never understood the context for his fame, and fame without context is meaningless. His fame had seemed meaningless to me. This was one of the things I wanted to understand, and I wanted to try to make a connection with my father. We'd never had a real relationship as adults, and I thought this would bring us closer together. As it turned out, now that he could tell me his perspective, he couldn't remember most of it anyway. He'd had experiences that seemed fantastical and impossibly glamorous, but all he'd wanted to do was forget them. He remembered that he thought Jack Benny genuinely didn't like him. Everything else was vague, a memory of a memory. The one thing that he was emphatic about was he wasn't a real prodigy. He'd been built up by the producers of Quiz Kids as pro-Semitic propaganda. Once he'd said it out loud, he repeated it to me every time I saw him for the next few months. It was the war, and they wanted a cute Jewish child. He'd obviously been thinking about it, that one aspect of it, for decades. This idea took a long time to sink into my mind, partly because I'd been raised not to think of myself as Jewish. My mother is Scandinavian, and when we'd gone to churches, they'd been Lutheran. But when I started to think about my father's Jewishness and I plugged this idea into his story, it suddenly made so much more sense. The sentimentality which surrounded him took on a more charged, symbolic tone. A fairly cute kid who can do math quite well has never been such a big deal at any other time in American history. It could only have happened with a Jewish child during a war that many people saw as a fight to save Jews. I think there were other things going on. A lowering infant mortality rate and the spread of media meant that children could be appreciated for their adorableness instead of being grimly shepherded into adulthood. But the Jewishness was certainly a big part of my father's appeal. I still wasn't sure what kind of story I would be able to tell, but after my father was diagnosed with dementia in December 2012, I decided I was going to try. I thought maybe I could do research and confront him with truths I had discovered, and this would unlock memories, or perhaps even slow or reverse his dementia. I didn't know then that this wasn't possible. The basic story was obvious. My grandmother was an ambitious stage mother who'd pushed my father into show business. He'd been a sensation on Quiz Kids when he'd started, but he stayed on the show too long, until he was an awkward teenager and on TV where everyone could see him. I'm going to show you a short clip of him answering questions on the TV version when he was 15. The guest host is Fran Allison. This show was being broadcast at this time on NBC at 8:30 p.m. on Fridays.
Take out 1 cup from the coffee to the milk. You have X plus 1 cups in the milk. And of those X plus 1 cups, X are coffee and 1 is of milk. So when you transfer a cup back, of that cup, 1 over X plus 1 will be of coffee, while X over X plus 1 will be of milk. So if you take the 1 over x plus 1 away from the 1, let's say x plus 1. You get x over x plus 1 cups of coffee left in the milk, and you'd have that much milk in the coffee, so it'd come out even.
No, Joel, if one were just determined to find out the answer to this question, it would be much cheaper to have someone like you around.
Other kids hated my father by then because their parents had all told them to be more like him. After finally leaving the show, his life had been hell until he left the country for a while. I wanted to know more. During 2013 and 2014, I spent countless hours researching. In the real world, I visited Paley Center and their library, where the librarian, Jane Klain, showed me the typewritten notes that were kept on index cards of early NBC broadcasts, and Columbia University, where I went through the bequested papers of the Quiz Kid producer. But most of my research during that time was done online, and Google was the net I used to pull material from the vast ocean of the internet. I'd follow basic search terms for hours, discovering new facts or details that I'd use to refine my next search. I'd discover a hint of something, follow it to a certainty, hunt for the evidence. I scoured old radio sites, news archives, auction sites, and anywhere that had information. I searched Google News and Google Books, sometimes quite frustrated by the cryptic snippet views of 70-year-old books, but I found out quite a lot. To give an example, I noticed a quote by Orson Welles that suggested he had met my father. I searched obsessively until I found an entire newspaper column about my father meeting Marlene Dietrich and Orson Welles. I kept searching, and I never found a picture of my dad with Marlene Dietrich, but I did find this picture on an auction site of Orson Welles doing a magic trick for him. My father looks delighted, but if you follow his eyes, you can see he's looking off to the right. Because of the newspaper account of this moment, I know that at this exact second, someone off camera to the right has told him Orson has rabbits and he can pet them. He wasn't interested in or impressed by Orson Welles and his magic at all, although Orson didn't take it personally. There are kinds of research you can do now on the internet that would have been at the very least extremely difficult in the past and very likely impossible. You can trace the history of an idea. For example, the idea of child prodigy, first used in the second half of the 19th century, and you can trace the origins of untruths. A lot of the cute things my father said were obviously made up, and in fact I've been able to trace some of them to scripted dialogue my father delivered on radio shows. Sometimes another quiz kid will say something clever, and within a few weeks it's being reported as something my father said. It definitely seems, looking at all the evidence, that my father's specialness was being deliberately exaggerated by some columnists and reporters. One person I became aware of through the internet was the brilliant producer of Quiz Kids, G Cowan, who, as it turned out, was one of the people in charge of American radio propaganda during the war, which seemed like a huge coincidence given what my father had been saying and everything I had noticed. G Cowan, born Cowan, was a fascinating person. A very smart man, he later invented the television game show with $64,000 Question and became president of CBS's television division. After leaving Quiz Kids and the country, my father came back to television one more time to appear on the spin-off of Cowan's show, the $64,000 Challenge, a CBS TV program. Apparently the show had been rigged, although my father claimed barely to remember. He insisted only that I shouldn't tell anyone. G Cowan had had an enormous amount of influence on my father's life, and my father didn't remember him at all. But, as I was starting to realize, my father's pre-dementia memory gaps meant more than I had seen. To not remember your crazy showbiz experiences when you were 6 or 7, that could be said to be normal. But he'd claimed not to remember a lot of stuff from when he'd been a teenager and in his 20s that it seemed would have been impossible to forget. Being violently bullied by your roommates at college, for instance, I found descriptions online by a former roommate who'd become a passionate racist and white nationalist. But my father denied that the bullying had ever happened. The racist seemed quite crazy, but I believed him. My father had erased memories from his mind because they were too much for him to handle. The real story was beginning to appear in front of me, and the story was trauma. Even if I couldn't find details of his experiences, I could see their shape in the imprint that had remained on him. And I couldn't stop thinking about how the kid I kept reading about and listening to in old radio recordings was in some ways a very different person from the father I knew. The kid loved baseball, he loved comedy, and could be extremely funny himself. He could play the piano. I had never seen or heard my father mention baseball, perform comedy, or play the piano, or even let on that he could. Decades earlier, he had told my mother his game show experience, and between what she remembered and my research, I was able to put together how the game show had tricked my father into feeling dishonest. He'd come back this one last time because suddenly game shows were paying big money, and he thought he'd be smart and do what he'd done for a decade one last time and make some money for his future. He'd only made $18,000 from Quiz Kids, and people were easily making 10 times that in 1 week on the bigger shows. He didn't know that the sponsors had seized control of the process and demanded the right to choose the winners through dishonest means. His first appearance on the show went smoothly, and the sponsor must have liked him, because before the next show, another contestant approached him and showed him facts in a book that turned out to be the answers to that night's question. There's no recording of the show, but I'm quite sure that my father only realized what was happening when he was live on air answering the question. He would have gone ahead and answered it, and then he left, making it clear he wouldn't be back, with the producers almost certainly begging him not to say anything. He was never on TV again and refused all interview requests for the rest of his life. He became a philosopher and devoted himself to studying character, morality, and ethics. It had definitely been his mother that had set up that last disastrous TV appearance. Who knows if she knew it was rigged or would have cared if she did. She still dreamed that he could become a television personality, even after it was clear he was really not suited for it and hated everything about it. This was something else online news archives showed me, that my grandmother had maintained friendships with newspaper columnists and was feeding them items about my father in hopes of stoking interest. She couldn't stop. She couldn't let it go. A couple of years after his quiz show experience, the whole enterprise came crashing to the ground, as seen in the movie Quiz Show, a movie my father refused to see. During the hearings, Quiz Kids was brought up as a show that had maybe not been completely honest. The kids had been softballed questions about subjects they knew very well. And again, my grandmother was eager to talk to the press. After all this, I don't think he ever really forgave her, and yet I don't think he could ever admit this to himself. Now I know that I should have been able to see the size of his fame reflected in the size of his trauma. And now that I could see the effects on him, I couldn't stop noticing the effects on me. The man I'd thought of as a mild-mannered and repressed professor was a traumatized ex-child star. The timeline of my life suddenly looked very different. I interviewed my father one last time, trying to get some reaction out of him with everything I'd learned. I couldn't stop myself from asking why he hadn't helped me with homework like his father had. What he said next still rings in my ears. Nobody told me I was supposed to build a relationship with you. In a way, he was more honest than he'd ever been. This was our last coherent conversation. Let me be clear, I did an enormous amount of research on this project, but one of the main things I did was really think about my father and my family. Obviously, by this time I was wrestling with a lot of emotions about it, but I felt ready to start trying to make a book. Between 2013 and the middle of 2015, I produced 3 drafts which weren't good enough. This was a very painful period as I tried to shape this story and wrestled with my feelings. What I was doing wasn't working, and I couldn't figure out how to fix it. The thing that really saved me was cleaning out my parents' house in Mansfield, Connecticut. My wife and I had, by this point, spent years in cleaning out the house, which my parents had largely abandoned, partly out of filial obligation and partly because we were trying to use it as some version of a vacation house. But it was uncomfortable, too far away from New York, and always more work than it was worth. It was horribly full of stuff. My parents had never thrown anything away. I threw mountains of junk away, recycled it, burned it, filled dumpsters, and there was always more. But finally, it yielded results. In a corner of my father's study, well hidden in a secret space, behind other books, were 5 scrapbooks that my father had obviously hidden decades earlier and then forgotten. Even when he'd wanted to help me uncover his past, he hadn't remembered them. They turned out to contain an exhaustive record of my father's quiz kid career. Newspaper clippings, itineraries, tickets, scripts, photographs, passes, autographs, an avalanche of paper. One of them turned out to belong to his sister, my Aunt Harriet, who had briefly been a quiz kid herself. It hadn't lasted, though, and she'd been given the role of being a housekeeper for her father, so her mother and brother could go touring around and meeting Hollywood stars. She obviously hadn't wanted her scrapbook, and it was easy to understand why. There was a lot of withheld emotion in these scrapbooks, a lot of frustrated hopes, and they were full of information and insights. The way that they'd been so well concealed and completely forgotten was very telling. They brought new life to the story I was trying to tell, and in fact their discovery provided a narrative jolt that starts the engine of my book. It was an incredibly lucky find. By now I could see most of the book and set about doing a new draft. The price I was going to have to pay was becoming obvious. The story was my discovery of how my father's fame had traumatized him, and it had made a real relationship between us impossible. The whole process had changed the way I saw him, but also the way I saw myself, because I now saw how I had been shaped by his trauma. And I was going to relive those feelings nearly every day as I worked on this book, because I had to feel them in order to express them. The main goal was I wanted people to read this book and feel some of what I'd felt and not be bored by it. My goal was to create a graphic novel that could be very easily read, that would not be boring and would convey emotion. From this point on, there were multiple drafts, and drafts within drafts, as I tweaked and reworked elements and removed excess material. By now I knew this was not really a book about old show business or the war or TV. This book was about fathers and sons. I had my theme, and the story was coming into focus, and everything extraneous had to go. The next draft, which is the one my agent sold, was different from the finished book in some ways. The original art was much larger, at least double page size, and I was portrayed realistically. This was intensely difficult for me. I am one of those people who has a lot of trouble with their self-image. I cannot see a photograph of myself without getting upset with how ugly I am, how poor my posture is, how fat I am. This is an issue I've struggled with but never overcome. I was determined to try, though, to come up with a realistic likeness of myself. Of course, I could photograph myself, but I still had problems with realizing my physical shape. So first I drew my shadow, my shape, and I started to work from there. Ultimately, though, I decided it would be best to come up with a version of myself that would seem more universal and the reader could identify with more easily. It was a boundary I struggled with, and ultimately this book involves my feelings, but it's not about me, it's about him. That's what I decided, but there's a later point in the book's development where that was underlined more decisively. This draft of the book was delivered to my agent in July of 2016 and sold by the end of August to Gallery 13, a subsidiary of Simon & Schuster. I was given an advance that would have seemed enormous 10 or 15 years earlier, but not now with a family and with a deadline less than a year away. The task of creating this book seemed literally impossible. I had never, ever created a work of this size or pages at the rate that were now required. I was stricken with terror. Plus, the advance was not large enough so I could simply afford to concentrate on the book. I would have to do other work at the same time. I can still taste the fear. It all seemed absolutely impossible. Adding to the terror was the fact that I was determined not to use the computer so much this time around. I wanted to do the art and every bit of the lettering by hand. I'd been using a computer font and other assists for a while, but I felt they never looked as good or as real. I adjusted my attitude and saw that all of my challenges were also opportunities. I wanted the art in this book to look spontaneous and loose and feel immediate, not tight and fussed over and distant. If I took my original art size down, much closer to print size, and worked as quickly as possible, maybe it would actually work better for the feeling I wanted. It was also an added incentive to keep images as simple as possible. I created model sheets of some characters and backgrounds I could use, including my own homemade Zipatone. I was also doing weekly comic strips for two websites, AdultSwim.com and Vice, while I created this book, but that too felt like an opportunity to keep my hand practiced. I tried to hypnotize myself into becoming a machine of comics creation. I probably drew close to 300 pages of comics during 2017, and I lettered them all by hand. This was an intense challenge psychically, physically, and mentally, and adding to all this was the psychic trauma that I was essentially living in every day. I had to make the reader feel the emotions I felt about my father and the trauma I now saw I'd inherited, and that meant I'd have to live in those emotions. I'm lucky to have a loyal and supportive wife. The book had been due in June, but that was a soft deadline, and I actually delivered the close to finished draft in August. But there were problems with it. There literally wasn't an ending yet, but also the final chapter focused much more on me and the kind of person my upbringing had created. As my editor pointed out, it had an angry tone and was at odds with the rest of the book. I told him I would fix it. I took the book back, thought a lot about it as quickly as I could, and then I completely removed the last 2 chapters and reworked them. I removed most of the material about myself, leaving only a few moments that I felt summed up our relationship. I moved our final painful conversation, the one where he says nobody told him he should build a relationship with me, from chapter 9 to chapter 8, and instead constructed a more emotional, elegiac ending that I felt brought the book full circle. I submitted this new final draft in January 2018. At this point, obviously, I was well past deadline, but I had made the original deadline less relevant by taking on the responsibility of doing every piece of it myself. After editing, the book was then copy-edited a couple of times, and nearly all the mistakes were caught and fixed. The interior of the book was completely finished on February 26th. The cover was finished at the end of March. Just as with the insides, every bit of the cover was done by my hand, except the barcode. I wanted the story to pull the reader forward, to feel like an experience, and I had to leave out 1,000 details and anecdotes in service of the narrative flow. One thing that got left behind was the idea that my father came from the pre-war reality, where dynamic individuals dominated the news and created the inventions that changed the world, but then was caught in the post-war reality, where committees and organizations, like the men who developed the atomic bomb, became the norm. Computers took the place of people in doing calculations. The first programmable computer in the United States, the Mark I, was built by IBM in a Harvard basement in 1944, and according to the press at the time, it was nicknamed Big Joel. I'm very proud of the book, and I think I hit most, if not all, of my goals. I think that the story has an urgency that makes people want to read it all at once. I believe I've created a relatable story with recognizable emotion. I'm receiving responses from people all over, people I've never met, who identify with this story. But there's one way in which this book has failed. I really hoped I could build a connection with my father before dementia took him, and I wasn't able to do that. Maybe I understand him now, but ultimately, although there is hope in it, that's why this is a story of frustration and loss, which may be, at least partly, why it resonates with others. We've all felt that with our families. Many of us have tried to repair our families and given up. It's the human condition. My son is now 9. His school sends us emails complaining about his behavior, and it's exactly the same behavior that was described in glowing terms by the reporters who wrote about my dad. What was encouraged is now discouraged. If my father had been a child now, he wouldn't have been a celebrity. He would have been drugged so he would sit down and shut up. America tends to extremes. Thank you.
Now that you're a dad, if your son were ever to write or, create something about you, what would you hope that he would say?
Well, of course, I'd hope he'd think I was mostly a good dad and had been a good influence and tried to not do what my father did wrong, in our relationship.
What does being a good dad mean to you now?
Well, I feel, for me, it's about appreciating who he is and trying to guide him so he can be the person he's supposed to be and treat other people nicely at the same time. He's a very enabled child, which can be its own struggle because he's very interested, he's very passionate, and he can walk all over other people sometimes. So I think as a parent, what I'm trying to do is guide him to do what he wants to do, but to also be the best self he could be, and to have manners and body awareness. Those are the other main things. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sure.
How do you feel as a parent now about your father's mother's, your grandmother's choices raising your father?
I think they were terrible choices, really terrible choices. He should have left the show after the war ended. His life would have been so much better, I think. The desire to keep him on TV was just inexplicable. And it doesn't make sense from any viewpoint. Also, you know, she thought he could have a career in show business, but she was never canny enough, for instance, to negotiate his contract with Quiz Kids again. So he was making the same $75 per show 10 years after he started and was on TV. It's really hard to think what she thought the end game was or how she thought he could have been a TV star. So it's just, it's confusing to me because it doesn't seem like good strategy. And in fact, of course, it tore the family apart in a certain way. So I think it was both bad parenting, but bad parenting that's inexplicable in its kind of pointlessness.
Hey, so thanks for such a wonderful talk. As someone who read the book, I found the talk nonetheless incredibly arresting, so thank you. So one of the things that's wild that comes through in the book is that, like, your dad was so insanely famous, and then just, like, wasn't, right? Like you didn't even really know, right? And I feel like it's wild that you went from being so remarkably well-known in the country to sort of just, like, forgotten. And I was wondering if you could say what's up with that? Is that, like, a unique set of properties of the difference between the cataclysm of World War II and
I think it
afterwards?
was.
Or is it what's up with that?
No, I think it was. I think it was a unique experience, and the aftermath was unique. In some ways, he was very lucky as someone who wanted to escape from it because, excuse me, during World War II, of course, people were being told to recycle all paper, and there was not much frivolous merchandise. So in a way, he was famous at the best time for it, if you don't want to be remembered. The ability to record video wasn't invented until '47, and even then, it was done sparingly. I think there are 3 remaining Quiz Kids shows with him on them. And radio shows, there are about 130. But part of it was that people weren't that interested in the past in those days and in the decades afterwards. They were excited about the future, and nostalgia only really started to be a thing, as I remember it, in the 70s and 80s. But by then, the people who really cared about Quiz Kids, you know, didn't anymore. It was a cultural phenomenon, and his fame was sort of just a combination of circumstances. So there was nothing to bring it back for people beyond the sentimentality they individually felt for him, you know. So he was very lucky in some ways, because if he had been famous now, of course, he would never have escaped. The video would be there forever. The radio, everyone would remember him, you know. And it did take decades. I was still being asked by people if I was related to him until the late 70s, early 80s. But then it seemed to vanish completely.
Cool. Thanks.
Yeah, sure.
So the experience seems to have been a pretty uniformly terrible one for your father and to have done tremendous damage to your family. Do you think there's any good, maybe not for you guys, but any good at all that came out of Quiz Kids and what your father went through?
Well, I mean, I'd like to say this book. I don't know. It's hard to imagine, you know, since it was such a profound experience that really changed everything in the family, how things would have been different. I suspect my father would have been a very different person had he been allowed to grow up not on radio and TV. There were obviously some good aspects. The money that he did make, he used to buy a house, which was the house we lived in. It enabled him to do a few things he couldn't have otherwise. But for the most part, it's hard to think of other aspects that were positive. Certainly for him, you know, it seemed to be wholly negative. Even the parts that you might have thought of as joyous for a child, he claimed he didn't enjoy them at all. So I'd say apart from the money, which wasn't much, and maybe this book, I can't think of any, really.
So, sorry, me again. You mentioned that some of this seems to have been intentional propaganda as part of, you know, the fight against anti-Semitism in the United States. Do you think it had any effectiveness in that capacity, or was it just a good idea that didn't, or maybe not a good idea that didn't work out?
Well, since I'm doing this book, I've been getting a lot of responses from people, and some of them are actually old enough to have been around then. And someone was telling me just a couple of weeks ago that it was huge for his neighborhood in Brooklyn, that, there was this Jewish kid on the radio and they were all very excited about it. So, yeah, maybe it did. It's possible it did. You just never know. I found information about that, that side of propaganda very hard to find. And in fact, if you look some places on the internet, they claim there was no black propaganda, for instance, by America during the war, which is not true. And I looked and looked for any kind of smoking gun that this was a deliberately planned thing. I couldn't find one, of course. Not that I thought I would, but I had to look. But I think it was a deliberate choice to put him on radio as a Jewish child and to build up his image. But even if he wasn't, that was still the effect. So it was either accidental or intentional or part of each. But I have found citations that Louis G. Cowan inserted propagandistic messages in American radio shows to improve the image of minorities and servicemen and so on, and also was doing radio propaganda for overseas and was involved in the creation of the Armed Forces Radio, and would insert messages meant to be heard by the opposite side in some radio shows too. During when I was looking at his papers at Columbia University, I found a mention that when he put a message in a radio show and he wanted it heard by the enemy, they made sure that the announcer read it at quote-unquote dictation speed, which was very interesting. So it's something I strongly suspect and feel to be true, but I have no solid proof of it. But I think there was a positive effect, possibly, by all these Jewish kids being featured. I don't know for sure, though. Anyone else?
Well, Mr. Kupperman, thank you so much for coming. This was absolutely fantastic and moving talk. Some of it was honestly a little hard to watch, that clip of your father on television. As moving as your book is, it was an entirely different experience hearing you talk about this live. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you.